So I want to start a series where I do budget builds for the other classes. I don't play them a whole lot, and I don't play them in depth enough to really give insightful information of exactly how to play it and to min-max the character so it's fully optimal. But with that aside, there's still many of you there who are just wanting the basics on the class to generally how to play it so you can get through, let's say, random queues. And so I'd like to at least give my insights, modest that they are, on said class, and this video will go over the Fighter Vanguard. I've went through many an ancient dragon hunt on my fighter tank, and we didn't have much trouble at all. You can see in Dragon Slayer I've gone through 27 dragon hunts. So this being a budget build, meaning it's budget on my end, not exactly yours. If you don't have this stuff, then you won't exactly consider these things as budget. But the most important part is going to be your power setup. Just really don't go copying my build gear for gear piece, as that is definitely not optimal. I will go over in the specific sections what gear and equipment you want on your tank. There'll be timestamps in the play bar below, so you can skip to any part you're most interested in. Before we get started, I'd like to give a massive thank you to all of these channel members for the continued support. First up, we go to our powers, and the main mechanics of a tank in general, and specifically a fighter, is we're going to have our block mechanic, which is going to be left shift on PC, and when you have an enemy who attacks you, you can hold up that, or you can hold down that button of your left shift, and you can see whenever you take a hit from the enemy, you will get those shield markers while you're blocking. Now, while taking damage, this shield bar on our left there will slowly drain, as it only has a certain amount of hit points, just like yourself. And when you read the tooltip, that's equal to 40% of your total maximum hit points. Whenever you have anything that will regenerate stamina, that will increase or regenerate that extra layer of hit points, your shield, back up, allowing you to block more and more. So it's essentially like self-heals by healing your shield. Then we have the tab mechanic, which is dig in on the fighter, where you'll go into this crouch stance and you can block even more damage. This time you can block up to a total of 60% of your maximum hit points, so it increases the effectiveness of your stamina by a little bit. On top of that, you gain the benefit of 15% awareness, which will help your survivability through your defensive stats, which we'll go over in a later section. Now, as a common benefit to your block mechanic and your dig in is you have the ability to gain immunity to most control effects. So if the enemy has attacks which would otherwise stun you, knock you back, throw you about the place, then you could gain immunity to that and essentially avoid that crowd control effect. Of course, some bosses have abilities that can just simply ignore that. That's why it says most control effects. Otherwise, you have your retaliate ability, which is very good on a fighter just for dealing damage and increasing the threat. It's also an area of effect, so you can have multiple enemies in front of you. You go in your dig in, and when you release it, soon as you've taken a hit, you will deal damage then to those enemies. It does have a 10-second cooldown, so you'll only be able to use that again after the 10 seconds are up. The way it works, you can see your shield goes red and you need to release it in time while it's red to actually cause that damaging effect. If you release it too late, you don't deal that damage. Otherwise, you're a tank, you have increased threat, and that's your forte stats. Now we jump to our at-wills, and generally what you will use is threatening rush to basically make sure the enemies are attacking you and not your allies. Otherwise, you will be using, at least for me, Brazen Slash to try and restore that stamina, which is again that shield you see on the left there, so you can block more often. And you will juggle between blocking and attacking to try and avoid taking damage off your actual hit points. So you will generally block and attack, then attack back, and then block. And it's a bit clunky on the fighter, I find, compared to the paladin. Generally what you will do is just rotate between your dig in ability and then your attack, and try and time it right, and then be able to block attacks while also going between attacking and blocking. There are other options, but I haven't found them to be very impactful, like Tide of Iron. Doesn't seem to do a whole lot. We move to our encounter powers, and For me, Enforced Threat is one of the main powers you want to use just all the time. It's good for AoE, but only after your allies have done a bit of damage. But the really good benefit is reducing the awareness of all targets, meaning your allies will be able to do nearly 10% more damage against those effective targets. The area is also pretty nice, and the uptime is a full 10 seconds, meaning you nearly have that effect always active, especially on a boss fight. Then we go to our shield throw, which you will use to just increase your threat to make sure that they're looking at you and not your allies. And the cooldown of that is super low. You'll be spamming that all of the time. It's also a ranged ability up to 50 feet, so pretty easy to use there. And thirdly, I use Line Breaker also to increase the threat. I'm a budget tank build, relatively new to the fighter, so I'm just going all out on those threat powers. If I need survivability, then I will try and just switch out to something like Knight's Challenge to restore your shield nice and quickly. But your main objective and the most content you will be doing, at least for me, it's not that hard to survive. So we're just running with everything that gives us extra threat to make sure the enemies are attacking me and not my allies. So when you run into a fight, just try and make sure you have combat advantage. Let's say my allies are there, we'll just go run around our target, we'll toss our shield throw, do our Line Breaker, and do our Enforced Threat there, and then just use a bunch of your shield bashes and just keep doing shield bashes between dig ins to try and block attacks and get that retaliate. You want that retaliate pretty much straight away from the get-go, and then just keep rotating between those. If you really need some shield back, you can switch to your shield strike, this one here, the Brazen Slash. Otherwise, just keep using those counter powers when they're off cooldown and you're good to go. That's about it on a fighter. You just make sure try get that retaliate every 10 seconds and just spam down those encounters and spam that right click for your shield bash. Again, if you need survivability, switch to Knight's Challenge and Iron Warrior. You might want to switch out your Line Breaker first for one of the survivability powers, and then potentially Enforced Threat and just use Shield Throw to hold aggro. I don't recommend it. Always try and keep Enforced Threat and Shield Throw. Alternatively, you can switch Enforced Threat over to Anvil of Doom and use your Anvil's Challenge. You would generally use that when you need to, let's say, switch between two bosses, but we're not running Master Trials, so that's really generally not an issue here. Lastly, I would say don't underestimate Knight's Valor. It can be very good, but only when you're running with, let's say, some melee DPS characters who are gonna be within 25 feet of you to actually gain this benefit. You essentially give them full protection. They take no damage, you take it all instead, and the threat they deal, so all the damage they deal, is effectively directed at you, so the enemies think you're dealing the damage they are. I've found it very useful when I'm a rogue and a fighter tank has that up in the Rise of Tiamat trial. So next up we move to our daily powers, and I generally just use Bladed Rampart all the time in combination with its feat. Whenever you have that up, if there's a period of time you know you're going to be taking lots of damage and lots of hits, then pop your Bladed Rampart, and that will allow you to deal extra damage to whoever attacks you, along with gaining pretty massive buff with regards to the stats that you gain. We can pretty much just with that cap our defense and awareness, which is pretty crazy, but just keep in mind you need to make sure that you time it right, use it when you actually need it. Otherwise, you can use Earthshaker and AoE just to stun enemies and deal some damage to them. Then for our class features, I'm just running with Shield Talent for stamina regen and Steel Recovery also for stamina regen. Alternatively, you can switch to Greater Endurance for some extra movement speed just to keep up with everybody. And again, if you're switching to Anvil of Doom instead of Enforced Threat, then you can use the Anvil of Challenge. As for our feats, I generally totally just go with Shield Thrower. It puts the cooldown to really low and just increases the threat it generates, meaning effectively it's way easier to hold aggro with that. Second pair of feats, really doesn't matter. I don't use Bull Charge and I don't use Rising Tide. I don't use the Tide of Iron. Maybe I will in the future. I might need to mess around a bit more on that. Otherwise, third set of feats, again, this really doesn't matter. I'm not really focusing on my stats much at all. Again, it's just a budget build, and yeah, they're just all over the place, so you're really not getting much benefit here. Otherwise, this one has a cooldown of only once every 5 seconds, so pretty questionable, and 10 stamina is pretty small compared to your 100 pool. And then fourth set of feats, I generally just go with Sharpened Senses. However, I will say Perfect Block can be very useful. The problem is it has a 3-minute cooldown, so unless you're running Pacific content where you know you can use it, it's generally better to always have Sharpened Senses with your Bladed Rampart, have that extra 30% awareness boost, especially on a budget build where you don't have a lot of stats. Gaining an extra 30% is massive, even though it's just for a daily power, and you'll only have a daily power every 30 seconds or so. Last one, you just want Shake It Off, and that's just really good to make you retaliate, deal that good bit more magnitude damage, meaning you can get more increased threat and also help in AoE as well. So now we move on to the statistics you should be using. And on a fighter tank, in my opinion, the priority is defense as high as you can get it, unless you want to maybe rely on your Bladed Rampart for 30%. Don't think that's going to be very useful in endgame. Just try and make sure that just get that defense nice and high. It doesn't particularly matter. Awareness, you can leave it around 45%. At least I am doing so with Bladed Rampart, and this one, that'll get me up to all the way 90% just by going in the dig in for the 15%. Plus that 30% when you have that daily up. You can see both defense and awareness cap there. And then otherwise, I prefer to go with critical avoidance on my fighter, unless you can manage to stack a bunch of deflect stuff, which is not as easy on a fighter as it is on a paladin. So we're just going critical avoidance. Hit points is like a last resort. You never really focus on that unless there's no other better option for adding survivability. So next up, we move to our gear, and I would recommend having at least one gear piece with the Manticore's main bite. It allows you, when you cast a daily power at the beginning of the fight, to gain a pretty big damage hit off the enemy. You can see we got over 200k there, and that is him mitigating the damage as well. But during an artifact call in harder content, it can be absolutely what you need to hold aggro at the very beginning. Otherwise, you're just running gear which just gives you more stats for your defensiveness, and also you might have ones which give you damage resistance. There'll be a link to a video below where I've gone over all the recommended gear that I advise for tanks for module 23, and you can see that here is all for your head, your arms, all the way down through even to your shirt and pants. And that's generally what I would recommend. Have a look at the document, have a look at the gear, but while you're just leveling up, while you're just going through random queues and other content, try and pick up gear that again just gives you extra defensiveness, and usually you'll be fine. But again, try and get one with the Manticore main bite, either by having like a Tanner's ring here will help when we're out of combat. We should be able to see that. This cheap Tanner's leather ring has also the Manticore's bite. I would recommend picking up Masterwork weapons instead of Lionheart. They can, I'm pretty sure, be cheaper at this point. Just look up in equipment like Mastered and Usable by me. You'll find this being the main hand there, 800k, and the offhand 1 million. Otherwise, you can look up Feywood, and I think these are really expensive because they're not cheap to make, especially for that offhand, for that shield. So let's move to our modifications, and again, on a budget build, I'm not really chucking any modifications on here. I don't know if it's the gear I'm going to be sticking with, but if it is, then I would chuck in some defensive stat modifications on the armor kits, and on the neck, rings and waist, you generally chuck in some awareness stuff here, and otherwise some stamina. Weapon modifications, you'll probably want here your enhanced threatening rush, and then on your offhand, you'll want like enhanced one of your defensive stats, again ideally not health, and generally go with recharge speed here for this modification. For enchantments, doesn't particularly matter. We just got a bunch of critical avoidance in the defense there, and we're running with a recharge speed. I'd like to run with the movement speed, but for some reason it's broken on tanks and basically deactivates when you block and doesn't reactivate when you unblock. I'm running with a soul shield here just because if I do die, then that will save me on scrolls and it'll pick me up. And otherwise you could run flash freeze or fortified nature. It's up to you, but flash freeze can be that bit more reliable, especially the way it is now. Would highly recommend an artifact that helps your allies deal more damage. Again, the content you're running within random queues is usually pretty trivial, and just generally getting through it quicker is the best way to go. We go to our race and ability scores, and you can see I'm a tiefling. Not exactly the best thing for a tank. I would recommend one of the rogues or the renegade, and otherwise any race that gives you extra defensive stats. As for ability scores, you want to go with just constitution and charisma. I don't really see why you would go with anything else except perhaps strength for the extra stamina regen and damage boost can help out a little bit. So we move to our companions, and here you generally want to run with an augment which gives you defensive stats. The Iron Stone of Might, not exactly best. You want to be running something like the Butterfly augment or the Cat augment, or just any other companion you have at hand. But if you have a mythic companion enhancement, an augment will help you a lot with the stats it can provide, regardless if you upgrade it or not. Companion equipment, again, just go for those defensive stats. And then for your bonuses here, again, just defensive stats. You might want to pick up the Lich for the added damage resistance, but that's about it. I would recommend Armor Break here to reduce the enemy's defense, so your party members can kill them quicker and get through the content faster. As for mounts, again, just here in the current tab, going with defensive stats in the equip power here, and ideally one of the combat powers that will help your allies deal more damage. As for the stable, just go with Gladiator's Guile here. I'm running with that just for the pure movement speed. The rest really don't matter. They're just pretty trivial bonuses. You can pick up some collars to slot in here, and I would go like stamina regen and counter power damage and recharge speed. It's probably the best ones that you would go with. As for boons, again, not really a big deal. You can go with all the defensive stats ones here, along with movement speed and your deflex severity, and then go with like recharge speed, and then also probably stamina regen, or you could potentially go with Forte for a little bit more stats. And the top one, you may as well just go with focused retaliation. As for our consumables, well, we're on a budget build, so no real need, and the content doesn't really require it either. You could of course run with Caprice from your summer festival. It will give you the extra HP and also the deflect, and otherwise in your Vault of Piety you can buy some of these elixirs of steadfast devotion, but if you're overcapped on that defense awareness, go with your Foehammer's favorite elixir. With that said, hopefully this was somewhat insightful and helpful to you fighters out there who are just starting out in the game. Again, this is a budget build, beginner's guide. Just wanted to go through what you kind of want to focus on and prioritize as a fighter tank, and just from my experience playing as the fighter. I've gone through many ancient dragon hunts and really haven't had much problem tanking it. Of course, I generally go with a somewhat decent healer. We have the paladin healer here, which can definitely be a nice comfort to have that extra shields. But otherwise, yeah, not too much trouble at all. Even holding aggro against people with Band of Air. Just running those 3 increased threat powers really helps. I jumped into Lair of the Mad Mage just earlier today just to see what it would be like, especially with AoE fights. And generally with your fighters retaliate along with a ring with the charging bull. You can get one from the dragon hunts here, the Ring of Celerity, will help a lot. And overall, this run in Lair of the Mad Mage really didn't go too bad whatsoever. I did have quite a patient group, nobody with Band of Air though, so it did take a bit of time. Just make sure you wake up those scorpions, all 4 at once, hell yeah, and really not much trouble. Nothing really deals too much damage within these random queues that you're going to have much trouble at all, as long as you have the right kind of power setup and a few little bits bonuses to your defense. So again, I'd like to give another massive thank you to all of these channel members for helping me keep my channel going. And if I presented this well, consider leaving the video a like. If you're new around here, consider subscribing. I'll see you guys around. Goodbye for now.